now to the two authors of the stimulus study, Republican Senators John McCain of Arizona and Dr. Tom Coburn of Oklahoma. Welcome. Senator McCain, they're going after you in the White House, and they're saying your top advisor is in favor of this. Do you want to make a comment? Have you reacted to the White House criticism?
I don't usually react to the president's flack, but Mr. Zandi was not my top economic advisor. He was one of the hosts. My top economic advisor was Doug Holtz-Haken, who was former head of the CBO, you know, who has a very different view of the economy and this pork barrel spending, which has mortgaged our children's futures, about $1.1 trillion worth.
Senator Coburn, does some of this bill, this so-called stimulus bill, actually kill jobs? I mean, that's sort of an unintended consequences deep into the report. What is the story here?
Well, let me talk about that, Larry, but if I can take you back to what was said by the White House, when you spend $600 billion, which is what they've already spent, sure, you're going to have an impact. Nobody's disputing that. We didn't say that the $600 billion, we just said, here's an example of how Washington doesn't work. And when you're throwing this kind of money, stupid things, nobody with any common sense would ever agree to have their money spent on these things. So the consequence of the feint by Mr. Gibbs, he didn't want to talk about the fact that we do everything inefficiently and highly ineffectively. And that's the point we're making with this report. Not only did we waste a ton of money on things that absolutely don't need to be done, and could have been done in a much better way that would actually have created jobs, we actually eliminated a lot of jobs and shut down a lot of businesses because of the bureaucracy and the mandates of the programs as they got laid out. And that's the critical factor, is the incompetency coming from Washington. Anybody can spend $600 billion in this economy and have an impact. The question is could you have had a whole lot more impact if you spent it smartly?
Could I also add, Larry, very quickly, you know, you can talk about saved or created or all that. What they said at the time of the package, the stimulus package was passed, was unemployment would be 8% or less. That was what they said was fact. We know it's 9.5 and possibly going up. And they added environmental impact statements are required, Davis-Bacon requirements, which puts 20 to 30% additional costs thanks to the influence of the labor unions here in the radical environmental community here in Washington.
I mean, Senator McCain, look, you got, you know, monkeys on drugs, you got yoga and hot flashes, you got BP getting $300 million. Maybe that'll pan out, maybe it won't. I mean, look, isn't this the sort of thing the public is revolting against, that government overreach creates all these unintended consequences, including some areas that actually kill jobs, the reverse of what we wanted? I mean, isn't that the basic theme?
Well, absolutely. And the waste of money and the adding to the debt, it's $1.1 trillion when you look at interest. And you talk about this all the time, Larry, and so do people we have on. What happens when we have to keep borrowing so much money because of the debt, 41 cents out of every dollar, that we start crowding out, the government starts crowding out private investment? Isn't that an incredible bad impact from this kind of legislation?
All right, so Senator Coburn, let's go to the other side here. Treasury man Tim Geithner, Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner, wrote an op-ed piece in today's New York Times. Now, you know it's coming. He says, first of all, the economy is recovering. He specifically cites private sector consumers and businesses are investing. Second, he says this stimulus plan saved 8.5 million jobs and it increased GDP by 6.5% above what would otherwise be the case. How do you respond to Secretary Geithner?
Well, I'm sure it did create some jobs. I'm sure it did save some jobs. I'm sure that it probably did have an impact. The question is we've spent $600 billion, well on our way to $1.1 trillion, and we could have done better. And that's the point of this report, is within that mass of spending is a large dose of stupidity and absence any common sense. And so, look, John McCain and I both voted for a very different stimulus, one that would have had a multiplier effect much higher than this and wouldn't have spent as much money and would have actually done a better job. But it still would have had problems because of the administration of a stimulus program.
What would that have been, Senator Coburn? What would your better plan with a better multiplier have been?
for example, we've got 283,000 bridges in this country under disrepair. We would have fixed those. We're going to have to reset the military. We're going to have to buy equipment for the military on the basis of coming out of Iraq. Should we not buy that equipment at a cheaper price now that the multiplier on the defense industry is much greater? We could have bought it cheaper than what we ultimately would have paid for it. Those are very high-paying jobs. They're actually manufacturing jobs manufactured in this country that create a cascade of benefit down the supply chain. There's two areas that we could have made a major impact. Highways, half of the projects that went through the highway were on the shelf because they weren't a priority. And so we built stuff that wasn't a priority in terms of the transportation sector and ignored stuff that any normal, common sense thinking person would have said, fix the dadgum bridges. But we didn't do that. And we spent 60% of all this stimulus keeping state, federal governments working.
So Senator McCain
has a multiplier effect of about 1.2.
All right, but Senator McCain, what people seem to want, that's what the polling shows. New Gallup poll out today. President Obama's numbers are dropping again. People want less spending, and they want lower deficits, and they want reduced debt. Now, Senator McConnell is saying that you all are going to have a plan out in September, I guess, or sometime later in the summer, that's going to give the Republican agenda. Let me ask you now, just give us some sense of what this plan might be. You have criticisms of this big stimulus package. What are you going to say about spending? What are you going to say about deficits? What are you going to say about debt?
Could I just add one other thing to your answer to your question to Dr. Coburn, and that is also we had a provision that once real GDP after inflation increased by 2%, stop the spending. And that's, but look, obviously one of the provisions is going to be, and we're having a big discussion with the American people about it, one of them is a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Another one is repeal and replace Obamacare. Another one is spending freeze. I would like to see at previous year's levels, because it's already gone up 20% this year, domestic spending has. And tough medicine, frankly, I'm proud of what David Cameron is doing. Most of what they're doing is very important, including sending responsibilities and authority and requirement for funding back to local and state authorities where they belong.
All right, so balanced budget, repeal Obamacare, a spending freeze. Senator Coburn, what about the tax story? Everybody, the investment community is worried about the Bush tax cuts expiring, capital gains, dividends, the estate tax, the top personal rates. Where do we stand on the extension of the tax cuts?
Well, I think to raise taxes in the midst of a recession, or especially a pause in an anemic recovery, is the height of stupidity. What we're about is quit spending money that we don't have on things we don't need. That's number one. Number two is vigorous oversight of every level of the federal government, eliminating the duplication. Vigorous oversight, eliminating the fraud. There's $200 billion worth of fraud in the federal government right now on the programs we have. Eliminating the cheats on the programs that we have for legitimate people who really need our help, but because the programs are so poorly run and so poorly managed that a large percentage of the money is paid out to people who are undeserving. So I think that I will predict to you now that the tax cuts that are due to expire will be extended across the board for at least a year and maybe 2 years, because that is the smart economical thing to do.
All right, and Senator McCain, just to go back to your other point, there's a couple of $100 billion of unspent stimulus money. Now, can that be stopped? Can that be canceled? Can that save the spending baseline? Would that be a down payment on a long-term budget plan?
I would absolutely advocate that, and maybe if they haven't spent it all by January, that should be in our agenda as well. But, it's again, what are we doing to our kids and our grandkids? And I understand the argument that it may have had some positive impact, etc. But is there any real economist that you respect, Larry, that would say another $1.1 trillion to the debt isn't harmful in the long run?
Well, I don't know. My view is, sir, the private sector creates jobs, not the government sector. I mean, that's just my personal view. Senators?
Larry,
Yes,
Ken
sir.
Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart have already said that our gross debt to GDP is above 90% right now. It is suppressing economic growth by greater than 1% per year. That equates to over 1 million jobs that are not created this year because of the debt we have. We have to eliminate the debt. We have to downsize the federal government. We have to get back within the constraints of what our founders intended the federal government to be, and we can do that with very little pain on the American people.
Well, I think this is what the election's going to be fought over. I mean, that's what I'm hearing from both of you gentlemen. This is where we're going to go.
And I can tell you from town hall meetings all over Arizona, they're mad as heck.
All right, Senators John McCain, they're mad as heck. Senator Tom Coburn, we appreciate your time very much, gentlemen. Here's a programming note.